the Audubon Society. And I am with the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, and not speaking for our friends, but making sure we do acknowledge Topher Hamlet with Save the Bay, who couldn't join us today. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Meg.
Hi, I'm Meg Curran from the Conservation Law Foundation, and I'll hand it off to Scott.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Millar. I'm the Director of Conservation and Community Assistance with Grow Smart Rhode Island. I'll hand it off to Kai.
Thank you, Scott. I am Kai Salem, the Policy Coordinator at Green Energy Consumer.
Awesome. So we will get started. We're really excited you're all here today, and for folks who are watching after the fact. So we're going to talk a bit about solar siting challenges, how we can align state incentives with climate goals, between climate goals and core forest protection. And again, this is being hosted by the Nature Conservancy, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, Grow Smart Rhode Island, Conservation Law Foundation, and Save the Bay. And so the way this is going to go, this is in webinar format, but we have a short presentation for you all, and a number of us are going to run through it. So you won't have to listen to one of us for the whole time. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So feel free to put things in the chat or in the Q&A box at any point, and then we'll answer at the end. And then also at the end, you'll be able to come off mute and ask questions then as well. But we're going to go through the presentation first and then do Q&A. So hold your questions or just stick them in the box and we'll get to everything. So I'm just going to take us through the first few slides and kind of the purpose of the presentation today. So as we're thinking about solar siting, what we're thinking about here is how we achieve our climate change goals. So how do we both get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050? So building out a quantity of renewable energy that I think we haven't really grappled with, just how much we really, really need. And at the same time, how do we build climate resiliency to protect against the unavoidable impacts of the climate crisis? So things like increased storms, increased intensity of storms, and a lot of the things that come with that. And so that will entail the protection of a lot of green space, among other things. And we're going to get into all details in all of these, but our current renewable energy incentives push solar specifically really to green spaces right now. And so our big goals in this presentation, and also in the legislation that we're going to talk through that's pending this year in the General Assembly, is kind of threefold. So one, how do we really protect key forest areas from development overall? And here we'll talk mainly about renewable energy development. While at the same time, how do we strengthen renewable energy incentives on developed land so that we can really maximize the amount of renewable energy we're building in the state? And then in doing so, how do we really remove the silos that currently exist between energy policy and land use policy, knowing that they actually are quite intertwined? And when we think about climate resiliency, we're really thinking about this spectrum. So it's about reducing emissions. So how do we stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere? And so a lot of that will be a build out of clean energy, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, storage, energy efficiency, all the things that can help us reduce emissions. It'll also involve removing emissions. So that's things like trees, which can, and other green things, which can remove emissions and store them in their roots and in their structure from the air. And then third is adapting to unavoidable changes. So we already know that there will be and already are changes happening due to climate change, and we'll need to be increasingly resilient to those changes. And some of that will be around, as we already discussed, increasing intensity of storms and sea level rise, things like that, and having nature-based solutions that help us adapt to some of those changes will be necessary. So Scott will talk more about the various benefits of open space and forests, but that kind of goes along in that continuum. And it is a continuum, the more we do of one, the less we need to do of others, and vice versa. So there's a lot of things we need to do to increase our resiliency. And the last slide I'll do, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kai, is, why are we focusing on solar and solar incentives and solar development in particular? And right now in Rhode Island, almost 70% of our forest loss is for solar. There are other things that are displacing forests as well. And those could be housing, commercial uses, other things. But right now, by and large, the greatest amount of forest is being lost with solar. And most of that is happening through state-sponsored programs, which Kai will discuss in a little bit. And so we have kind of incentives for keeping open space open, and we also have incentives for building solar on it. And these are right now kind of, these are at conflict. And so this is really about solar incentives. It's not about building things in general. Like a lot of our forest land, which Scott will discuss, is in privately owned land, which we cannot dictate what people do on privately owned land. But it's about really what are we incentivizing as a state and what are we providing these extra incentives for. So I am going to turn it over to Kai to take it from here and talk a little bit about the incentive programs we have currently in Rhode Island for renewable energy.
Thank you, Sue. Great way to frame this conversation. So as we started off this discussion with, the climate crisis is here in Rhode Island, and we are focused on meeting our Act on Climate goals. Green Energy Consumers' mission is to speed that transition to a low carbon future, but we are renewable energy advocates. However, we're really thrilled to work with our amazing allies who are more focused on conservation, because it's helping us learn more about how we can make sure our renewable energy goals don't conflict with our climate resilience goals, our climate goals, or our the many other reasons that forests are valuable and necessary in Rhode Island. I want to zoom out a little bit and mention that in order to meet our climate goals and get to what we want to see, which is 100% renewable electricity by 2030, the main way that we're going to get there is through offshore wind. Solar is important for balancing offshore wind electricity, and it's important for making sure we have local good jobs in renewable energy. But we are not in a situation where we have to cut down every tree in the state or all of our forests just in order to meet those climate goals, because we have other sources available to us. That said, solar is still a good thing. And I wanted to take a few minutes to look at the different incentive programs that are the government programs that are currently driving solar development throughout the state. The biggest programs are net metering, virtual net metering, and renewable energy growth. These are really complicated words that don't mean anything on their surface. So we'll talk about what those are in the coming slides. A couple of other programs that we will not talk about today are a bit more marginal to the picture of how solar is developed and where it goes. That includes the Renewable Energy Fund, which is small grants to get projects off the ground. It supports both rooftop solar, there's a solar on brownfields program, and more. It also supports non-solar renewable energy. And then there's long-term contracting. This is a very small number of projects compared to the projects done in the other programs, but the actual electricity produced from these projects is really big. Our offshore wind, for example, will be constructed under long-term contracting, as well as a big gravel pit solar in Connecticut that the state has contracted for. Next slide. So net metering. This is perhaps the simplest way to explain how solar is incentivized in the state. If you want to put solar on your rooftop, this is a very common way to do it. In this diagram, we have number one, the solar PV system. The solar panels are on the roof, and that solar primarily offsets the electricity usage in your own house. But sometimes, you're not at home during the middle of the day, but it's sunny, the solar panels are still producing. And so the extra electricity goes out of your house through your electric meter and onto the utility grid. As it runs through the electric meter, it essentially runs the electric meter backwards. That's why it's called net metering. And so it reduces your electric bill in a 1-to-1 ratio from the amount of solar that you are putting onto the grid. Said another way, you as a solar producer are being paid the electric rate, that changing electric rate for the solar electricity that you are putting onto the grid. This means that you are getting kind of a premium for your solar. The utility company is paying you a lot of money for that solar, because when you pay your electric bill, you are not just paying for the electrons, you're also paying for the person to come fix the power lines when there's a big storm and it's down, and you're paying for the poles and wires, and you're paying for the substations and all of these other things that the utility company does for you, not just the electrons. So net metering is great because it supports rooftop solar. We want rooftop renewable energy. It does support grid resiliency because there's distributed energy generation, but it is just a fact that you are being paid a premium when compared to other sources of electricity. Next slide. Virtual net metering is that same concept, but now we're not talking about rooftop solar, also known as behind the meter solar. In virtual net metering, the actual solar generation is occurring at a different site from where the electric meter is. And now I'm going to introduce a new vocabulary word, off-takers. The off-taker is the person who benefits from virtual net metering. Under net metering, the off-taker is the person who owns the solar panels and who probably lives in the house that those solar panels are on, because that's the person who the project is on their roof. They're benefiting from it because they get their bill reduced as those solar panels produce electricity. In virtual net metering, sometimes someone else owns the land that the solar panels are built on. Sometimes the developer owns the solar panels. The off-taker is the person who is under a contract with the developer with that solar company, and it is their electric bill that is reduced because of the solar energy that is being produced. The developer makes money because it is a lot cheaper to build solar panels at scale, at utility scale. And in virtual net metering, it's possible to do that. It's possible to build a really big solar farm out there on a forest, open space farm in a more rural area. That's less expensive than doing rooftop solar for that same amount of solar energy. It reduces the electric bill or takes it away completely of an off-taker. And Rhode Island off-takers are only allowed to be nonprofits, schools, churches, the government, not just any business. And so this program has created a big incentive for developers to site large projects in green space where it's cheapest to do so, and partner with off-takers in the nonprofit sector in order to give them solar energy and the financial incentives that come with it. Next slide. Renewable energy growth is a completely different way of incentivizing solar in Rhode Island. Under renewable energy growth, you, a developer, builds some renewable energy and you get locked into a 15 or 20-year contract with the utility company to buy that electricity. The price at which the utility company is buying the electricity is set annually in consultation with consultants and an oversight board. And only up to 40 megawatts of renewable energy may enroll in that program per year. 40 megawatts is really small, especially compared to other states. Some solar developers look at this program and basically say, I'm not even going to try. This number is way too small for my business. It's just not worth even having a business in Rhode Island because this program is too small to make it worth it. The price of the electricity depends on the category. For example, rooftop solar, it's more expensive to build, so rooftop solar electricity gets paid more. There's also wind, anaerobic digestion, and other forms of renewable energy included in the program. Next slide. So to compare these a little bit more, renewable energy growth program has a lot of oversight. Virtual net metering, there isn't as much oversight because nothing in the program really needs to be approved year to year. Renewable energy growth prices and incentive levels are set every year. Of course, you can't go back and change the prices from 10 years ago that have already been locked into a contract, but the prices do change every year. They have tended to go down over time. There is that 40 megawatt annual cap that I already discussed. And with the oversight has come some regulatory adjustments. So We have anti-segmentation rules in renewable energy growth, which means that it limits the impact of renewable energy growth solar projects on forested land. There's also the option for the DG Board, Office of Energy Resources, to propose adders, subtractors, and other regulatory changes to influence where we want to see solar through this program and other factors. Virtual net metering has an unlimited annual cap, which means that as long as the developer can find an off-taker, they can build more. There's no limits on segmentation or where virtual net metering may be placed, other than local ordinances, which a lot of towns do have. And then, of course, just the economics of building one of these big projects. Next slide. Oh, that was the last slide, I guess. But one other thing I wanted to mention is that because the price fluctuates every year, in virtual net metering, the price fluctuates every year. And also in virtual net metering, the utility company and thus ratepayers are paying even more than in renewable energy growth for the same electrons. It does tend to be a worse deal for ratepayers than renewable energy growth. And that's how our incentives work.
All right, now it's over to me. Thank you so much, Kai, for that thorough explanation and the great graphics describing how our renewable energy programs, in particular virtual net metering and renewable energy growth work. We think that is important context when we get to discussing what we're proposing for this legislative session. So with that said, just a reminder, I am Priscilla De La Cruz. I go by she, her, hers. I am the new Senior Director of Government Affairs at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. At some point, I will stop saying new because it's been about 8 months now, getting close to that 1-year anniversary. And I will say from Audubon's perspective, we are cautiously optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. And I think this webinar is part of that, the way we've been able to come together to really focus on the challenge and the goals. But with that said, do want to acknowledge some of our peers who are on this webinar and have been working on the solar siting challenge for well over 6 years. So I thank you for your continuous work, and hopefully this session we can get towards a path forward. So that's what we'll be discussing today. And I also did want to take a moment to recognize Representative Corcoran, who has joined the webinar and has been a great resource and ally in brainstorming potential solutions for how to address the challenges that we're facing with solar siting. So thank you again for joining. Next slide, please, Sue. Thank you. So a path forward. So here's where we've been spending the bulk of our time working with Rockstar Representative June Speakman and really trying to figure out a path forward. And as Sue and Kai have covered, how do we truly realign our renewable energy incentives with our climate goals, and truly recognizing that the status quo is not working, that our programs as structured, in particular virtual net metering and renewable energy growth, are at odds with the Act on Climate. So a lot has changed, right? Last year, the landmark piece of legislation, the Act on Climate, was passed, really setting a required path for the state to reduce carbon emissions across the board, and ensuring that we meet those targets is critical, but also ensuring that we protect a very critical public investment of ours, which is our open space and our core forests, for all the benefits that have been mentioned. And Scott will get into more of that as to why forests play a very critical role as we're talking about climate resiliency. And the other dynamic of the status quo not working is that we are seeing more cities and towns push back and passing ordinance to prohibit solar development. So that is also at odds with our goals around the Act on Climate. So working with Rep. Speakman and with other colleagues who are not currently on the call, and just really getting good feedback from a variety of stakeholders. And also talking with Senator Ilana DiMario, really brainstorming what is a way to move forward. So thinking about the bill that was introduced by Rep. Speakman, House Bill 7531, how do we align in-state renewable energy program incentives with the Act on Climate? But more in particular, how do we shift the incentives toward preferred sites for solar development. And we will get into what we mean by preferred sites, and really ensuring that our state programs are not contributing to the clear cutting of forests and are not at odds with this public investment that we have. And Scott will talk more about the definition of core forests. Next slide, please. So here we're going to slow down for a bit for a couple of minutes and talk about what is proposed in 7531. So before I get into the particulars of these boxes that you see here and the two big goals that we're trying to achieve with this current legislation, just want to, at a high level, just talk about more reasons why we support 7531 introduced by Rep. Speakman. So as we've really emphasized throughout this webinar thus far, how do we provide a tangible step forward to really realign our program incentives with our Act on Climate goals? And how do we start to add in that layer of protection for core forests and really ensure that we're redirecting incentives toward preferred sites where we want to see more solar development expanded in those preferred sites? How do we define preferred sites? So that's included in this legislation. And how do we really maximize development in already disturbed sites when considering our Act on Climate goals? And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean of these preferred sites. Then another provision in the bill, it's also acknowledging that there are solar projects already in the queue, and acknowledging that some of these projects have already made significant investments towards their interconnection costs, for example. So really acknowledging some sort of safe harbor clause for those projects that are really further along and ensuring that that is accounted for at the time of the passage of this bill. Of course, fingers crossed, that is the goal at the end of the session. So further getting into what is being proposed, again, the context that Kai provided was excellent because I think it'll really lend itself as to why we are proposing expansions to the Renewable Energy Growth Program in particular, and how the 40 megawatts that is allotted per year under that program no longer aligns with our climate goals. So why not expand that to 200 megawatts per year in preferred sites? So that is something that we want to emphasize. And in net metering, why not lift the limitations on project sizes for projects that are in preferred sites? So again, just really making sure that these incentives are driving development towards preferred sites and away from core forests. Really significant to the Renewable Energy Growth Program is adding language around climate change, adding and recognizing the Act on Climate passage, and also our conservation and resiliency goals as a purpose for the expansion of this Renewable Energy Growth Program. And then a part of the provision in the current Renewable Energy Growth Program law is a 5 megawatt cap. So if a project is being developed in a preferred site, why not expand that? So that's another reason why we support that proposal. And then Kai referenced the Distributed Generation Board that provides oversight to this Renewable Energy Growth Program. So for us, that's a great appeal because we want that such oversight over a program that is benefiting ratepayers like renewable energy growth. So what we're trying to do with the Distributed Generation Board is provide them with more tools and resources to help us get at resolving the solar siting challenge. And that could involve hiring more consultants to look at this challenge and the structure of the program more closely. Then we're also saying we want to offer additional incentives or offer that option to additional incentives that could be offered by the Distributed Generation Board, as Kai mentioned. And that could include anything from locational incentives where projects are sited, considerations for climate and labor standards, and that is all for the purpose of when the annual pricing is being developed for this Renewable Energy Growth Program. And also the tool of being able to possibly enable disincentives for if we're seeing solar continue to be developed in areas where we don't want them, like core forests. So other significant changes proposed under the renewable energy growth expansion is also particularly calling out carports and solar on schools, specifically as preferred sites and as targeted development. And this is really critical more than ever, as recently the Public Utilities Commission did not include the carport adder for this renewable energy growth program. So part of this balanced approach is making sure that we have the incentives and that we're driving development towards smart solar siting, and really being able to offer a carport adder is part of that. So now shifting over to how we're limiting, thank you, Sue. How we're limiting renewable energy, why we're limiting renewable energy in core forests. Scott will speak more to the specifics of that, but one of the key things is defining core forests. But I do want to take a moment here just to highlight that as the bill was introduced, H7531, it does talk about conservation opportunity area. So what we're doing now, working with key stakeholders and this working group that is hosting the webinar and legislators, is really focusing more closely on core forests. And let's see, just making sure I mentioned everything else I wanted to provide here in context for you all. Nope, that covers it. But lastly and not least, rooftops everywhere are okay. So really making sure that we are allowing and enabling as much rooftop solar on rooftops as possible is also a key component of this legislation. And we can go ahead and proceed, but I also do welcome any of my colleagues, if you think there's something significant that we miss in this area, feel free to chime in. Okay. So next, just wanted to highlight this because often we have been asked as advocates, are there other areas that are more suitable for solar are there other spaces other than open space and core forests? And the answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, the state has done, in particular, the Office of Energy Resources and Synapse Energy Economics have done a study called the Solar Siting Opportunities for Rhode Island, and really portraying an analysis of where we do have the potential to maximize solar development. But we want to take that a step further. We want to be able to identify preferred sites. So the Nature Conservancy, along with the Audubon Society of Rhode Island and Brown University students, we're taking a closer look at these preferred sites using data like you see on the screen from the Office of Energy Resources, data from National Grid and the Department of Environmental Management, to really take a closer look. If we're saying not here in core forests, then where are we saying yes? And where are these sites in particular? Next slide, please. So preferred sites, what do we mean by preferred sites? We've hinted at a few of them. We've implied rooftops, solar carports, those are canopies as you see on the photo here, gravel pits, landfill sites, brownfields, Superfund sites, commercial and industrial zones. So that is defined within the legislative proposal. Next slide, please. So lastly, just another example that there are case studies out there, right, in our backyards that show the potential when we maximize these preferred sites, like in landfill sites. So this is a very known project in Forbes Street in East Providence. So I will stop there because I think I've exceeded my time and kick it over to Scott.
Thank you, Priscilla. That was just an excellent summary of the proposed legislation. Very well done. So why forests? Why are we concerned about forests? Why are they important to conserve? Next, please. I'm going to take a lot of the information I'm about to discuss out of the Value of Rhode Island Forest report. This was done by DEM working in conjunction with the Rhode Island Tree Council, published in 2020. It's just a wealth of really good information about Rhode Island forests. Next, please. And forests yield clean air and clean water that benefit all Rhode Islanders. The forest is by far the best and land use to protect and maintain high quality drinking water, high quality water that we use for swimming and boating. About 80% of Rhode Islanders get their drinking water that are protected by forested watersheds. So it's really critical to maintain forest for clean water. But also we don't think about air quality that often when we think about forests, because the forest has this amazing ability to absorb and store a lot of air pollutants, which is particularly important if you suffer from respiratory ailments. According to the Department of Health, they've estimated that value to be about $30 million annually. Next slide, please. And again, we don't think of Rhode Island as being this major timber producing state. We certainly aren't, but a surprising information that came out of this analysis is that the primary and secondary wood products contribute over $750 million annually to Rhode Island's economy, and that's almost 5,000 jobs. And this is an area of our economy that we think has tremendous potential to expand. Next slide. And obviously forests allow a tremendous diversity of wildlife to thrive. There are over 450 different species, vertebrate species that depend on the forest at some point in time for their very existence. Next, please. And I think we're all very much aware there's just an incredible amount of outdoor recreation opportunities that benefit all Rhode Islanders. Next, please. But the forest is also a way, it's really the most economical solution to reduce carbon that's already been released to the atmosphere. As Sue mentioned, we have two primary goals with climate change. Obviously, we have to stop new greenhouse gas or carbon emissions as soon as possible. But the second goal is to really absorb and store the massive amounts of carbon that have already been released to the atmosphere. And clearly, the forest is really the only practical and most economical means of doing that. As an example, Rhode Island has about 368,000 acres of forest. It's been estimated that that forest can absorb and store the carbon emissions from about 100,000 cars annually. The New England Forestry Foundation, taking this a step further, has done some modeling to suggest with better forest management in northern Rhode Island, the potential exists to mitigate almost all of the vehicles in southern New England. So there's tremendous potential to have the forest help us meet our climate change goals. The Rhode Island General Assembly recognized that last year when they passed the Forest Conservation Act, and they made it very clear, in addition to the forest values I previously described, we need to conserve forest to meet our climate change goals. Next, please. So the sum of all the forest values is greater than any single attribute, because I often hear people say, well, that woodlot's not that valuable for timber, or it may not be that valuable for habitat, but collectively, all forest has values. Next, please. So why do we want to conserve the core forest? Next. This is showing you an illustration of what the core forest looks like in Rhode Island. As Priscilla previously mentioned, core forest is unfragmented or undeveloped forest. It's not broken up by development within 30 meters. It's 250 acres and greater. And the privately owned core forest is approximately 20% of Rhode Island's land area. And again, it might be hard to see in this graphic, but it's all the dark green on this map. The sort of light brown cover is also core forest, but that's currently in some kind of public ownership or under a conservation easement. So it's not subject to development. Next slide, please. When we look at that big map of core forest, it looks like we have these massive areas of unfragmented lands, but this is showing you a tight shot of what the core forest looks like. The dark green is unfragmented forest that's 500 acres and greater. The lighter green on this is showing you unfragmented forest that's 250 acres and greater. And what you can see is there's been an alarming trend to cut holes in the forest. We call this fragmentation. If left alone, the forest is this incredibly stable ecosystem that can be very resilient and last for literally several hundred years. But once we start cutting holes in the forest, we're introducing stress factors that previously didn't exist. Insects, disease, invasive species. The forest just isn't as stable as it would be if it was left intact. Next slide, please. So that's it for core forest. I'm going to turn it back, I think, to Sue to talk about additional next steps.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And thanks, everyone. That was awesome. You guys are so amazing. So wrapping up some next steps. So there are 3 next steps we wanted to talk about, but then we also want to have a lot of time for conversation. So one is the Nature Conservancy and the Audubon Society of Rhode Island have been working with a group of Brown students to really map out where these preferred sites are across the state. We really do want to be able to not just say, no, not here, but actively say, yes, here are some of the places, and let's figure out how to make this work and put them on maps and figure out how to overlay the different programs, incentives to really drive development to those places. And so those students are using data from the Office of Energy Resources, from National Grid, from the Department of Environmental Management, and others. And we should have some updates on that work pretty soon because their semester ends very soon. Cities and towns across Rhode Island also have been looking for training and technical assistance to help adopt responsible solar siting ordinances. So we mentioned earlier, some of them have been adopting some reactionary ordinances where they're like, oh, wow, we've been losing a lot of land to solar, no more. But there could be ways to have ordinances that encourage responsible solar or appropriately sited solar. And Grow Smart, where Scott works, has been offering this type of assistance and developing this guidance with cities and towns. We are also collectively on this call considering a stakeholder process to ensure that careful planning and changes to state policy that ensure that core forests are protected, but can also coexist with renewable energy sources and clean energy jobs. So what we're really trying to do with this legislation and also our partnership together, which as Priscilla mentioned, has been going on for many years. I don't want to make it sound like we are inventing this, but we're really trying to thread that needle of really wanting to maximize the amount of clean energy we are building while also protecting our most core and most important natural resources. And so directing the development to the places where it can best be utilized. So with that, those are our primary next steps, and we would love to hear any questions or comments that you all have, and I will stop sharing my screen so you don't have to stare at these next steps. And someone already asked in the chat whether or not this recording can be shared as a next step, as well as the PowerPoint, and the answer to that is yes, and we will make that available after the fact. And also a special thank you to Paige at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, who has been doing all of our Zoom IT and all of the things to make this webinar possible. So a big high five to Paige. And feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, or I think maybe you can come off mute or raise your hand and then we can take you off mute. Thanks, Terry, in the comments, Terry Meyer. We're glad you're all here to be part of this effort.
And we're happy to give you more time to type up your questions or reflect on the presentation and share any thoughts you have. And just acknowledging that in the Q&A chat function, there was a question asked about whether incentives are available specifically for rooftop solar on public schools. And the answer is that there are proposals in front of the legislature at the moment to actually make that feasible for incentivizing not only solar on public schools, but making sure that our schools are part of this goal of meeting our Act on Climate goals, is really low-hanging fruit to really ensure that these buildings are green, energy efficient. So solar is definitely part of that.
And
wanted-
Priscilla,
I
just
saw
to add
that.
to that, oh, go ahead, Kai.
I saw that Q&A as well. I wanted to mention that there, for almost anywhere in Rhode Island, especially I think because our legislation to not allow incentives on core forests has not yet passed, there is an incentive program that applies to a project. So if you want to put solar on a school building, you can do that today. But I think the question that is really important is that why aren't we seeing more solar on rooftops or more solar on schools? And any of you, if you go to Massachusetts, you know that it is visible to the eye when you drive around when you drive around the neighborhoods in Massachusetts, how much more solar on rooftops there are. And that's because their incentive programs for solar on schools are better. And that is something that we're trying to do here in Rhode Island. We have to increase the disincentives for where we don't want it, increase the incentives where we do want it. The legislation H7531 that we have proposes specifically delineating a certain amount of solar that must be put on schools. Another reason why we don't have more solar on schools right now is because there's a lot of administrative barriers, and schools are thinking about other things. Like they're dealing with COVID and buildings that are not up to par in other ways. So we need to think creatively about programs like a staff person at the Office of Energy Resources who can help all of the schools in Rhode Island get solar and things like that.
Michelle Sheehan asked a question in the chat. Can you provide any more detail on the anti-segmentation rules that are embedded in REG? And the quick summary of that is the Renewable Energy Growth Program prohibits solar or any projects that are larger than 5 megawatts. And so for solar, that is about 16 to 20 acres in current technology. And then it also has a further rule that you can't just co-locate multiple 5 megawatt sites next to each other. And so that keeps you from like fragmenting and creating these kind of like larger systems that break up the forests. The net metering program, or virtual net metering, technically has a system cap size of 10 megawatts, which again is about 40 to 50 acres. But there's no rule that says you can't just locate them next to each other. So what you get are these like larger systems that really break up and fragment the forests. And so that's what's currently embodied in the REG program. I don't know if anyone wants to take one of the next questions. Terry asks, how can individuals help?
Yeah, I can answer that one and then segue to the next one. So that's a great question. We want you all to be involved as we work to move this legislation forward. And I think a very concrete opportunity that's coming up is the Environment Council of Rhode Island is having its Earth Day at the State House / Lobby Day on May 4th. Kai is planning that, so we're super appreciative. And that is when the council unveils its top priorities. And in fact, we already have through a press release last Friday on Earth Day, and solar siting is one of them. So you can join us in person if you're comfortable. The speaking program starts at 3:30. We'll talk more about solar siting, but we'll also have an opportunity to interact with legislators. You can also contact your legislator and let them know that you care about this issue and that you support this particular legislative proposal as the bill hopefully progresses between now and the end of the session. And I'm sure that Audubon and our respective organizations will be keeping you informed and making it easy for you to engage with your legislator and share talking points. I don't know if there's anything else that folks would like to add to that. But I also wanted to, Kai, I think this question I will redirect to you. Someone asked, is a takeaway that there is going to be plenty of energy from wind and we don't need much solar, or just that we don't need so much solar that it would justify cutting down core forests?
Great question. I guess there's a few different answers. First, We don't yet know what type of renewable energy we will need in 10, 20, 30 years, or what the available technology will be. So it's hard to make any real predictions. And as a side note, if anyone says that they have a good idea of what type of energy we'll need in 20 years or how much it will cost, they do not. But we can make forecasts and predictions. And one thing that we know is that I think it's more the latter, that we don't need to cut down core forests because we're lucky enough to have such good offshore wind resources. However, solar on developed land and solar on rooftops is really, really good for our electric grid because it makes it more resilient and it reduces our need for building out infrastructure to get a lot of electricity from one place that's far away from everything to all of the other places where we do need electricity. And also we need solar to balance out wind. Offshore wind in particular, tends to be able to produce the most electricity on cold winter nights or in the winter more broadly. Solar is best at producing electricity, obviously, during the summer when it's sunny. So they balance each other out. We're going to need both, but we don't have to sacrifice our forests for that climate goal.
Thanks, Kai. So well said. Someone asked a question. Thank you, Melissa. You asked, do we have any insights on the Rent My Roof program through which Jobla is putting solar panels on some of its buildings? I do not, but perhaps others do.
I don't either. That's a great question. But very exciting that Joblot is doing that on the roofs.
Agreed. And another question that I'll put out to the group, what is the average cost to set up solar panels on a housetop?
So I'll jump in real quick and say that it really depends on a lot of things, like how big your roof is, how old your roof is, what your usage is, all sorts of things can vary with that. So the recommendation generally is to call, and also when you do it, because the incentives change over time. So the general recommendation is usually to call multiple solar developers and have them scope out your roof. A lot of them can look at your roof from remotely through Google Earth and tell you whether or not your roof is eligible, given like how the sun falls on it and if you have trees and all of the things. There is a list of folks who are licensed to install solar on the Office of Energy Resources website. And so that's a good list to go through to see who can install solar in our state. I can share that I have solar on my roof. It is a very small system because I live in a very small house with only 2 people in it. I think I have a backdrop of mine. No, I don't. Something happened and I don't have it anymore, but my system is very small and it was about $12,000 total for about 4 kilowatts of usage. And so that is enough for like roughly 2 people before I got my electric car. And I use the Renewable Energy Growth Program, and I'm happy to talk about my personal experience with anyone. And a lot of the developers now or installers have programs with lenders in case $12,000 or whatever your system cost is seems like really high. And my payback period was about 5 years. And so I actually got mine about 6 years ago. So now it's like technically fully paid off, given what I pay for electricity versus what I get through the Renewable Energy Growth Program. So it's all different depending on your roof and all the things, but my personal experience was that the payoff was about 5 to 6 years.
Thanks, Sue. And I want to highlight a couple other questions that we're getting in great comments in the Q&A feature. Thank you so much. Getting at Kevin's comment, I think brings up the importance of energy efficiency and how critical it is not only to our climate goals, but also to reducing energy consumption and demand overall. So Kai, I'm going to loop you into this one, but I think what Kevin is getting at here is that a good complement to this legislation, if not another component to the legislation, is really accounting for the reduction of municipal state and energy sector related to outdoor lighting at night. So for me, I think thinking about energy efficiency hand on hand and looking at a comprehensive solution, of course, is part of that challenge. I would say specifically that we would really like to keep this particular proposal very focused on solar siting, and really realigning the incentives that are offered in through net metering and renewable energy growth, and balancing out that protection of core forests. But that doesn't mean that energy efficiency is not important. So Kai, do you want to talk a little bit about energy efficiency?
Sure. I guess I'll say in some states, legislators really like doing what's called omnibus bills, where you take a broad subject, like in Massachusetts, they love doing bills that are long, have a ton of different parts. They have a climate bill every couple of years, and you have everything in there from land use to trash to taxes to lighting to solar, all of it. In Rhode Island, that's not how it goes. Legislators prefer short bills that are really specific in what they do. So I think if we were to add something like that into this bill, it would make both of them less likely to pass. However, energy efficiency is really important, and we have existing programs that are working to do this. Almost all of the savings from LEDs have already kind of been gotten over the last 10 years through a big investment by the state. It sounds like Smithfield might have been one of the last communities to convert to LED streetlights. The Energy Efficiency Council in Rhode Island and the energy efficiency programs just funded a last big investment into LED streetlights to get that savings. So I'm afraid that there's not a lot of savings left in LED, but that's thanks to all of the good work that we have done programmatically and by policy over the last decade to make LEDs the norm.
And another great question that we have in the chat from Anne is, would we need less solar if we promoted air pumps and geothermal for residential small industrial heating? And are there incentives for this in any upcoming bills, or should we say in current programs as well? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I can answer this one as well. This is such an interesting question. I think we do need to be promoting air heat pumps and electrified heat as much as possible. And that is simply just to reach our climate goals. Our climate goals assume that we are going to be moving almost entirely onto electric heat pumps and or geothermal, but we want to do that in the most efficient way possible. We will not need, I think that if we were to have more geothermal, geothermal does not require as much electricity as electric heat pumps. So we would probably need less solar. However, geothermal has some other downsides, like being more expensive up front. So I think it would be pretty marginal, though, the difference between those two. And I think Sue might have a better answer.
Wait, I have a better answer?
No, if you wanted to add anything to that, I was just also, I guess I'll jump in, and I was just thinking about one of the things that we often talk about when meeting our Act on Climate goals, and why, as Kai stressed earlier, that 100% renewable energy standard is important, and also how we drive offshore wind, because the reality is, as we work to decarbonize and lower the carbon footprints of our transportation and heating sectors, the way in which we heat and cool our buildings, we will need more clean electricity. So that makes 100% policies like 100% renewable energy standard and more offshore wind procurement really critical. So I guess from that end, I'm not quite sure if it'll necessarily mean that we'll need more solar, but as Kai has already stressed, there's no reason to go clear cutting our core forests in order to achieve those climate goals. And then lastly, what I wanted to add that Sue covered is, I know in the past there have been stakeholder processes to work on this very issue. So just wanted to add that I think part of what we're finding that the state really needs is that there's a void right now in terms of really analyzing how to expand renewable energy projects in a way that meets the climate goals, but also protects core forests and helps us meet our climate resiliency and conservation goals and also considering challenges like interconnection, other costs associated with developing renewable energy. But also we know we will have to invest in making more sites solar ready. So when we talk about preferred sites, there might be more remediation of landfills and disturbed land that has to happen. So how do we maximize the funding that the state has and will have on hand from federal dollars? And how do all these things come together? So really knowing that there is a need for example, statewide planning, DEM, Office of Energy Resources, stakeholders like you and I, developers, et cetera, to all work together. And of course, our utility in addressing this in a more comprehensive way. But what we're really getting at is how do we set a path forward this session to really start getting at this issue of solar siting. So I don't mean to have the last word, but it is 2:28. So if others would like to add any closing remarks, please feel free to do that. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much to friends and partners on this call and for this webinar. We will make sure that you will get a copy of the slides and the recording, and please share the information and other updates to come from us. Thank you very much.